don't like to be called tiny, we like being called compact. It's the most competitive tax environment in the OECD countries. There's only one thing you cannot do digitally.
Welcome to The Big Question. I'm Angela Barnes, and today I'm joined by Sandra Saräv, Estonia's Deputy Minister for Economy and Innovation. It's a pleasure to have you with us on The Big Question, Sandra. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, Estonia is really interesting to talk about when it comes to the digitalisation of public services. It was ranked 9th in the EU as well on the European Commission's 2022 Digital Economy and Society Index. But it's been quite the journey since 1991 when Estonia became fully independent again. So first of all, can you just talk me through, Sandra, the economy and infrastructure back in 1991 and how the country got to where it is now?
So just a little remark there. 9th we rank overall, but when it comes to offering public digital services, Estonia always ranks in top 3, as Estonia has 99% of all public services available digitally. There's only one thing you cannot do digitally, but we'll talk about this later. So first, I'll speak a bit about the infrastructure and where Estonia was at in 1991. So yes, I cannot remember it, of course, firsthand, as I was 2 years old at the time, but Estonia regained its independence and we had been illegally occupied by the Soviet Union for half a century. So for 5 decades, there was virtually zero economic growth. 1938, prior to the Soviet occupation, Estonia's economy was roughly the same as Finland's, which is our northern neighbor. Of course, we didn't estimate the GDP per capita at the time with the same accuracy as we do now, but roughly you could say that both Finland and Estonia had 2,500 international dollars GDP per capita. And then came the Soviet occupation. 1991, Estonia's GDP per capita was even lower than prior, than half a century earlier. So roughly 2,000 euros per capita. So you can imagine half a century of virtually no economic development compared to Finland, for instance, who had half a century to have economic focus and support. And their GDP per capita by 1991 was the same as Estonia's is today. So around 28,000 euros per capita GDP. So yes, this half a century didn't bring us any new developments. Our infrastructure was outdated. There was virtually no free economy. You know, it was a communist era in our history. So we had to have a fully fresh restart back in 1991. And luckily we had very young, fresh, new politicians at the time who thought that Estonia is going to need to do something different. And we did.
Was it necessary to build public infrastructure the way that you have done, and how do you think it has put Estonia ahead?
So half jokingly we say that we were too poor to afford anything else, which is in the same time it's also a correct thing to say. So we skipped a lot of the steps that people were doing in the second half of the 20th century. So we went virtually from 1940 to the new era of technologies. We realized that we need to be efficient, which is one of the keys why Estonia is so digitalized in the first place. I don't believe in digitalizing for the sake of digitalization. Digitalization brings you actually efficiency because you can do the same things with less resources, with less workforce. Estonia is only a country of 1.3 million people. You imagine we're not so big, but we don't like to be called tiny, we like being called compact. So we had to adopt digital systems in order to offer services in a more efficient way. The very first digital service that we had back in the year 2000 was actually tax declarations. So instead of queuing in line, doing some things on paper, bothering actual people with filling in the documents, we digitalized the service, and nowadays it takes less than 5 minutes to declare your taxes. So efficiency.
And what about, you said there is one thing that's not digitalized
Yes.
in public services. What is that?
So you cannot get a divorce. As of end of last year, you can also propose to someone online. So for the physical act of getting married, you have to show up in person. However, the filing of the documents or giving in the proposal, this can be now done digitally as well.
But the private sector hasn't subscribed in the same way, has it? Why do you think that is? Is it to do with the trust and digitalization or something else?
No, not at all. I mean, still, all of the companies are set up online. You cannot even set up a company, physically physically on paper somewhere, and still all the taxes are declared online. But the use of digital technologies, I think, has to do with the fact that we have so many companies. 84% are micro companies. I mean, if you set up your ice cream booth somewhere for the summer, perhaps there's not so much to digitalize. So I think this is where the secret lays. Why we're not so digitalized in the business sector is because we have so many companies, and a large sum of them are small companies.
What do you think other EU member states could learn from how you have progressed and how you've digitalised completely your public services, apart from the divorce, of course?
E-residency card is similar to Estonia's national ID card. So national ID card in Estonia is mandatory. So what's e-residency is, we figured we can give access to Estonia's business environment with a similar type of digital ID. It's not your personal identity document. You cannot travel with it. However, you can access those Estonia's digital services. You can open up a company online wherever you're based in the world, and you can open up a company in Estonia in 15 minutes and 33 seconds, which is a world record. So of course, this is only if you do it regularly. If you're a newbie, it would take you a couple of hours, but still it's very efficient. You can fully declare your taxes online, you can provide digital signatures for documents, you can acquire property, you can acquire new companies without ever having to show up physically. And currently we have globally over 100,000 e-residents who have opened around 30,000 companies in Estonia. And they not only bring us economic benefit by paying some taxes in Estonia, but they employ locally, they bring new innovation to Estonia. So we're really happy with the e-residency project.
So great for startups indeed. And tell us more about what else is great for startups in Estonia.
Well, in general, the business environment is very startup and company oriented in the first place. There's this E-Estonia trademark, and initially it meant electronic Estonia, but for me it means entrepreneurial Estonia. Being the Deputy Minister for Economy, I have to say it. But you can open up a company fast, you can declare your taxes fast. It's the most competitive tax environment in the OECD countries for 6 or 7 years in a row already. We have 0% corporate tax on reinvested profits. So unless you take out dividends, as long as you reinvest, there's no corporate tax in Estonia, which is a competitive advantage. Estonia attracts a lot of capital per capita again. So we say per capita Estonia always wins. In the year 2022 alone, Estonian startups attracted 1.3 billion euros. And this was on average 6-7 times more than in Europe per capita.
It sounds like a very appealing place then for startups to do business. And what does Estonia have to offer as well a foreign corporation wanting to set up a company in Estonia? I know you've given rise to globally successful companies like Bolt, Skype and Wise, to name a few.
Well, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on air, but Estonia has something called the Skype mafia. So Skype was set up initially in Estonia, and nobody uses Skype anymore, but it was very popular, let's say 10 years ago, 7 years ago. And so Skype was set up in Estonia, and those guys who were the early guys and girls who were the early employees at Skype, they went on and they built their own startups and companies. And along with the ones you've mentioned already, Estonia has 10 tech unicorns, which per capita is the most in Europe. And those people who built Skype then went to build on their own companies, and those companies of the first gen then went on and built their second gen companies, and now we're already third gen Skype companies. And this community is very, very tight. Estonia is a compact country, if you remember, so people talk to one another and they give advice, and this is a breeding ground for startups, if I may say so.
That's really impressive. 10 unicorns in Estonia, and that is impressive per capita. And Sandra, do you think I was reading about the planned 2% increase in Estonia's corporate income tax rate that's set to take effect in 2026. Do you think that could impact Estonia's attractiveness in the eyes of foreign investors?
Well, still, if it's going to be 0% or 2%, it's still more competitive than in most countries where it's your regular tax rate, which is 22%. Firstly, this tax is going to be only short term, so it's going to be set up not permanently but temporarily for 2 years. Our companies have themselves voiced that this is so-called security tax, that they're happy to contribute to the safety of Estonia via the security tax. And we're still figuring out internally how we're going to present this. Is this going to be presented as a corporate tax on profits, or if it's going to be paid from your social tax, the employment fund so-called. So we still haven't figured out the details, but the companies have said that this is crucial, that the companies who are based in Estonia actually also contribute to our security.
It's quite interesting because I read in Sweden that there were more entrepreneurs per capita for those under 30. This was a few years ago now, but the belief, well, what was behind that, they said, was that they, offer free education to students, and that the first loan, they believed, for youngsters should be a loan to start a business rather than to sort of pay off student debt. It was an interesting philosophy, which has obviously done very well for Sweden. And what do you think about that?
Couldn't agree more. I mean, student loans, they make banks wealthier or richer, right? But if students or people at a very young age start investing in their own companies, they become to have a more entrepreneurial mindset, and this is useful for the country as a whole. In Estonia, actually, higher education is also for free. As long as you study in Estonian language, anything you choose to study is free. And as a first-time company owner, you also get all sorts of subsidies or support from the government, or even from the unemployment office if you have been unemployed before. So I think it makes more sense to boost actually the economy with young people opening up their companies, as opposed to making the banks wealthier with the student loans. And it has been successful. Currently, roughly every 10th Estonian has their own company. So we have a lot of companies. Of course, 94% of them are micro companies, 1 to 10 people, but it gives you perhaps the first job experience, or it gives you the freedom not to be dependent on your employer. Or Estonia has 2,222 islands, and people on the smaller islands actually have the most companies per capita. Every third person has their own company because they're not dependent on having the possibilities of employment on this island. They can just simply set up their own companies.
Digital Agenda 2030, and you're aiming to become the greenest digital government in the world. Can you tell us how you're aiming to achieve that?
So firstly, I will tell you why. When we look at new technologies, they come with a large economic footprint, actually. You would figure that, yes, doing things online has a much lower footprint than having piles of paper. But actually, all the data warehouses, securing the data, it comes with a footprint, right? So if everything is online in Estonia, we also need to figure out how to reduce electronic waste. Electronic waste is one of the biggest segments of waste globally right now. How we can have more greener data warehouses and so forth. So we have been teaching courses amongst the public sector, how to procure in a more greener and innovative way, how to reduce waste that's not necessary anymore, how we can secure this data with much less use of energy and so forth. So it's a long agenda. We're still hampering in the details, but the goal is, yes, to become the greenest ICT country.
And who's your competitor in that field? Is there any other member state or neighbour that you think is doing that particularly well?
I think Canada is doing well, and Singapore.
Okay.
So globally, 2 countries we look at.
Okay, interesting. And Estonia is relatively small, as we've said. Do you think that's made it easier to create digital services?
So both yes and no. It's made it easier because obviously you have only 1.3 million people. However, it's more difficult because as we started in 1991, we didn't have a lot of resources, meaning capital. So if you are a larger country, if you have more capital, it's easier to build the best systems possible. So we've always had to innovate and be more inspired with what we can do with the resources that we have.
That's great to get your insights on all of that. Sandra Saräv, thank you ever so much for talking to us on The Big Question. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you very much for watching this episode of The Big Question. Do keep across Euronews Business on the Euronews.com website for more episodes of the show. And you can also head over to the Euronews YouTube channel if you want to catch them on there too. Thank you very much for watching.